Hello everyone, welcome to Ansarkari. So today we'll be taking up the newspaper for 26th of April. So over here with the first article, Indus Water Treaty, Shimla Agreement in abeyance, what this means. So this article basically deals with India's recent moves to put the Indus Water Treaty of 1960 and the Shimla Agreement of 1972 in abeyance with Pakistan. And this decision basically marks a significant moment in India's diplomatic posture towards Pakistan, reflecting a hardening stance amid repeated provocations, particularly cross border terrorism. So, the Indus Water Treaty, which governs the sharing of the Indus River system between India and Pakistan, it has survived major wars, becoming a symbol of resilience even in hostility. However, India is signaling now that adherence is not unconditional. This basically underlines a shift towards real politics over idealistic treaty obligations. So basically, even the Shimla Agreement, even that emphasized bilateralism and respect for the LOC, which is now being reconsidered in light of Pakistan's persistent violence. And this article basically explains the application of international law, specifically the Convention on Law of Treaties, which allows for the suspension of treaties under fundamental changes of circumstances. So, despite being placed in abeyance unless formally repudiated, the treaty technically remains binding, which is critical for understanding international legal framework. So this is for international relations and how legal instruments interact with national security concerns, and even how India's treaty behavior reflects its border strategic recalibration in a deteriorating bilateral environment. Then we have the next article over here. Is China even negotiating with the US on tariffs? So this basically focuses on the complex and often confusing trade negotiations between US and China, particularly when we talk of the Trump administration. And it highlights the inconsistent communication strategies employed by American officials, with President Trump sometimes suggesting imminent deals while simultaneously threatening more tariffs, leading to a highly unpredictable diplomatic environment. And this reflects a deliberate tactic known as strategic ambiguity, which is basically aimed at maintaining negotiation leverage while managing domestic political narratives. So, when we look at this from an economic standpoint, it basically shows how tariffs have been transformed from mere fiscal tools into aggressive instruments for economic diplomacy. And the uncertainty generated by these mixed signals affects global markets, investment flows, and supply chains, with direct consequences for countries like India, which must negotiate the secondary impact of such global instability. So this is the intersection of economic and interrelations, and talks about the complexities of modern economic warfare and the erosion of multilateral trading norms like those upheld by the World Trade Organization. Then we have the next article over here, why Crimea matters to Russia. So, as the US pushes for an end to the war in Ukraine, Donald Trump has said the Black Sea Peninsula will stay with Russia. So, over here, we'll talk about Crimea's strategic importance, which is rooted in its location. So, it's located right here between Russia and Ukraine, and it provides Russia with a vital access to warm water ports of Sevastopol, which is essential. Sevastopol is located over here, which is essential for maintaining year-round naval power projection. And even when we talk of it historically, Crimea was transferred to Ukraine in 1954 during the Soviet rule, but it remained a strong ethnic Russian majority, giving Russia a socio-political pretext for intervention. Now, beyond geopolitics, the annexation is also driven by economic and resource consideration, since Crimea offers control over lucrative offshore energy reserves and critical shipping routes through the Black Sea. So, over here, we basically touch upon the broader principles of international law, where Russia's actions they challenge the sovereignty norms which were established after World War II, and it also raises debates about the legitimacy of territorial changes enforced through military might versus the principles of self-determination. So this is basically an example to understand the real politic, the strategic calculus of regional powers, and also the fragility of the international legal order. So this basically ties on energy security, ethnic nationalism, and the resurgence of Cold War style great power rivalries. Then we have the next article, tractor and fertilizer sales data, a mirror of farm sector growth. So this basically reflects the sales trends of tractors and fertilizers, which serves as vital proxy indicators for the health and performance of the agriculture sector in India. And it notes that in the year 2024 to 25, it has shown robust growth, with tractor sales rising by 8.4% to 9.4 lakh units, which is nearing a historical high. And even the tractor sales reflect both farm and off-farm economic activities, and they have historically correlated with the broader rural economy momentum. However, this article also cautions that tractor sales alone may not always mirror agricultural production accurately, as seen in previous year when even the tractor sales dipped, but we maintained a healthy agricultural GDP growth. So, due to extraneous factors, they also have an important role over here, such as weak monsoons, price crashes, and export bans. So, fertilizer sales, on the other hand, provides a more direct measure of farm level activity as their consumption it directly impacts crop productivity. So, the data for 2024-25 shows an all-time high consumption of major fertilizers, particularly nitrogen, phosphorus, and potash. So, this basically indicates strong sowing activity and the investment by the farmers. So, however, we can see the growth was uneven since there were significant surges in SSP, which is single superphosphate consumption, which is a fertilizer variant more affordable for marginal farmers and suggests changing cropping patterns and affordability concerns. So this basically reveals a deeper insight how the farm sector performance cannot merely be gauged by aggregate output figures, and it must be understood through detailed indicators such as input sales, which basically reflect ground realities of farmer investment confidence, climatic conditions, and policy impact such as export bans. Then we have the next article over here, cracking the code. So this article basically offers a profound sociological commentary on the subtle yet pervasive forms of caste discrimination in India in the contemporary urban India. So this focuses upon cultural literacy, which is not merely formal education, and how that has become a crucial surviving strategy for the Bahujan youth in elite spaces dominated by privileged norms. So this basically shows the shifting, the less overt but equally rigid forms of exclusion. And it also points out how caste today often manifests through direct slurs, but through not through direct slurs, but through cultural shorthands. So it is basically fluency in global pop culture, fashion codes, dining etiquette, conversational reference, which many marginalized youth have to acquire painstakingly without inherited a social capital. So this struggle basically echoes to Baba Sahib Ambedkar's strategic emphasis on exposure to global knowledge system to challenge and dismantle the entrenched power structure. And also the narrative of individuals from various marginalized backgrounds underscore the access to education alone does not ensure true inclusion and how it must be accompanied by acquisition of cultural and symbolic capital to navigate the aspirational spaces. And even the emphasis on self-learning or through internet, Wikipedia or such site, it also observing elite behavior highlights the resilience and adaptability of the Bahujan youth. And when we talk of the deeper issues raised, is that is the one-sided nature of this assimilation, since marginalized individuals are expected to learn the dominant group's reference, the mainstream remains indifferent to the live realities, metaphors, and cultural wealth of the marginalized community. So this transformation from merely absorbing dominant cultural codes to asserting one's own narrative is presented as a radical act of reclaiming self-respect and agency. So basically it ties the broader debates about cultural hegemony, identity politics, and the power of art and storytelling as mediums of protest, solidarity across global movements. And even the next article is a continuation of these. How both pieces they present a powerful critique of how systemic inequalities, especially when we talk of caste, class, and cultural capital, continue to shape educational access and opportunity in India. And they also argue how success in elite spaces such as IITs, IIMs, and global universities is not just about academic merit, but about mastering the hidden language of power, confidence, articulation, reference, and social fluency, which, when we talk of the privileged students, they are taught from childhood, but marginalized students are systematically denied. So they basically argue how the Bahujan students with mere admission to colleges through reservations is not enough, and true opportunity demands cultural literacy, emotional support, and even institutional transformation. And Ismay, if we give the historical reference, so we have leaders like Jyotirao Phule, Savitrabai Phule, Shahu Maharaj, and Ambedkar, who understood how education was not just about literacy, but was also about dignity, self-respect, and access to a public life. So today, the situation remains urgent. Persistent caste discrimination, which is still seen, linguistic shaming, cultural alienation drive thousands of marginalized students to drop out of the premier institutes every year. So, scholars from marginalized communities who might receive global education frequently return to contribute to India's development, contrasting with privileged graduates who migrate permanently. So the policy makers, they must recognize that access must extend beyond textbooks and technical skills, and exposure to cultural codes, mentorship in articulation, and emotional belongings are not luxuries, but they're essential tools for building an equal India. And without addressing the deep gaps in cultural capital, the dream of education as an instrument of justice will remain incomplete. Nature source Delhi schools asked to strengthen the heat safety measures. So basically, the Directorate of Education has instructed all schools to strengthen the safety measures to prevent children from the heat wave. So this mostly includes prohibiting outdoor activities and ensuring supply of potable water at all times, even having functional fire extinguishers in case of emergency fire, and having functional fans, avoiding afternoon assembly, no outdoor classes, and scheduled water breaks integrated into the class routines. So cover their heads, basically everything to save them from the heat wave. The new wave of youth empowerment shaping the identity of Viksit Bharat. So the Rozgar Mela is basically distribution of over 51,000 appointment letters under the initiative, which was launched by the Prime Minister on April 26, 2025. And this reflects the government's broader vision of youth empowerment as a central pillar when we talk of building Viksit Bharat by 2047. So, with the help of video conferencing across 47 locations nationwide, this initiative shows the center's commitment to expanding employment opportunities amid a challenging economic landscape marked by post-pandemic recovery and the ongoing demands for young, rapidly urbanizing population. And even the government's focus on transparent recruitments through reputed agencies like UPSC, SSC, RRB, and IBPS, how they seek to uphold meritocracy while a strict anti-paper leak law addresses the long-standing issue of examination integrity, which is a concern that has historically eroded the public trust. And even when we talk of the policy perspective, such legal intervention also signals the state's attempt to protect the aspirations of the youth, which is critical considering India's demographic dividend. So the Rozgar Mela prevents a proactive step, which is critical in in today's context. And the scale of job creation, they must be matched against the backdrop of overall employment demand in the country. So it is a significant but partial response to the complex employment challenge that we face as a country. Then we have the next article. India, France all set to sign the Rafale M deal on Monday. So for this for 26 Rafale Marine jets, which is worth rupees 63,000 crore, and it will strengthen the Navy's carrier-based capabilities, replacing the aging MiG 29K fleet and the Rafale M with 22 single-seaters and 4 twin-seaters trainers will be deployed on INS Vikramaditya and INS Vikrant until the TED BF is ready. So this basically highlights India's defense modernization, self-reliance under Atmanirbhar Bharat and a strategic partnership with France. And it also supports India's preparedness for a two-front conflict scenario. DRDO boost hypersonic tech with scramjet combustor test. Now, this is a key milestone in India's hypersonic missile development. Scramjets, they're crucial for hypersonic cruise missiles and they can sustain combustion at supersonic speed with moving parts, enabling missiles to travel at speed greater than 6,000 kilometers per hour. So, the successful test strengthens India's technological capabilities in air-breathing propulsion system, enhancing defense readiness, particularly in the face of global advancement in hypersonic technology by countries like China and Russia. And this highlights DRDO's role in fostering self-reliance as it collaborates with industries and academia to reduce the dependency on foreign technology. So even in this, the defense minister, he endorses emphasis on the government's commitment to advancing critical defense technologies with focus on Indianization, technological self-sufficiency, and maintaining strategic autonomy in an increasingly competitive global security environment. The North and South should make a deal population versus revenue over delimitation. So the analysis of delimitation provides a nuanced understanding of the complexity surrounding the process of electoral redistribution in India. And delimitation is the process of readjusting the boundaries and number of constituencies to reflect population changes, ensuring the principles of one person, one vote, which is upheld. And over here, three main components of delimitation are highlighted, which is relocating seats between states based on population, redrawing boundaries within states to ensure equitable representation, and deciding the reservation of seats for marginalized communities like scheduled caste and scheduled tribes. So this process was frozen in 1976 and again in 2001 to avoid penalizing states with lower population growth due to successful family planning program. However, over here a partial freeze approach is talked about, which would help the total number of seats remain constant and internal changes such as redrawing the constituency boundaries and adjusting reservations can be made. Over here, he cautions against the creation of new fault lines in the country, especially if population based reallocation leads to a more division between the north and south or urban and rural areas. And also, he points out key concerns surrounding the delimitation process, notably the potential for biases or gerrymandering, stressing upon the delimitation to generally become a judicial process. So the issue of India's large constituencies, which reflect country's vast population, may need reorganization to better balance the representation. And this jointed system, accordingly, is a critical issue that needs to be addressed before meaningful electoral reform, such as idea of one nation, one election, which can be fully implemented. The imposition next to. So this article basically examines the ongoing political, economic, security challenges faced by Pakistan, highlighting the steep decline in the failure of traditional military strategies. And over here we talk of the terrorist attack in Pahalgam, Jammu and Kashmir, which is attributed to Pakistani terrorists, and contrast it with the relative decline in the territorial violence following challenges to Jammu and Kashmir constitutional status in 2019. And this article emphasizes the worsening situation in Pakistan, marked by political instability, economic hardship, and a fragile security environment, particularly due to resurgence in of the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan and growing unrest in Balochistan. So, India's response should be measured, and the temptation to escalate politically and militarily is high. And it is important for India to recognize that dealing with a weaker but hostile Pakistan requires a calculative mixture of incentives and disincentives, and engaging Pakistan for a position of strength is crucial. But also understanding this that peace, if it is to be achieved, must be based on strategic leverage rather than merely reacting to provocations. And Pakistan internal collapse, it is fueled by its political, economic, and security crisis, which would inevitably have regional India. It must adopt a policy which focuses on long-term stability, carefully navigating the complexities of the situation while ensuring national security. Even the next article discusses India's strategic approach towards Pakistan. And over here, India should acknowledge how Pakistan cannot be ignored from the security perspective, despite the growing power differentials. And it also stresses upon making peace with Pakistan, how that is pragmatic, intelligent approach as opposed to the failure of war seen in other global conflicts such as Ukraine and Gaza. The role of Pakistan military is crucial as it holds significant control over countries' security and foreign policies. Military manipulates domestic policies to maintain its power, often framing India as the eternal enemy to justify its. So, even the current political turmoil in Pakistan, especially with the imprisonment of former Prime Minister Imran Khan, has further exposed the weaknesses within the army's grip on power. And Khan's challenge to the army has resonated with the public, leading to internal pressure on the military leadership. And even Pakistan's military has also failed in securing its border regions like Balochistan, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, with increasingly insurging activities and militant attacks. So, this article basically discusses Pakistan's continued use of proxy warfare despite international pressure, and Pakistan's relation with other countries also, such as Bangladesh and China, and also focuses into the strategic situation. So, with the growing coldness between India and Bangladesh, and the strategic positioning of China provides Pakistan with opportunities to exploit the region's geopolitics. And this article basically talks about how India should leverage its global partnership to counter Pakistan's proxy strategy. So, India is advised to employ a strategic mix of military, diplomatic, and intelligent response to Pakistan provocations while simultaneously engaging in global diplomacy to restrict Pakistan's ability to sponsor terrorism. Having a balanced approach in dealing with Pakistan and recognizing its importance in India's security calculus while also ensuring global and regional strategies work in the tandem to push Pakistan towards abandoning its hostile policies. It is up to Bantam. So this article reflects the significance of the 70th anniversary of the Banding Conference, which marked the turning point in the political and diplomatic history of the newly independent Asia and African nations. So the Banding's conference principles, the central principles were political independence, non-aggression, mutual respect for sovereignty, and non-interference in internal affairs are still relevant today. And these principles basically aim to empower the newly independent nations of Asia and Africa in their context for quest for collective political and economic strength in the global order. And the conference emphasized the collaboration among countries in the global south who were dissatisfied with the marginalization of the global south. So these groups they basically aim to represent interests of the developing world against Western hegemony, especially in the context of Cold War. Even the challenges in the global order, such as declining trust in multilateral issues, institutions where trust between major powers is at an all-time low, leading to polarization and fragmentation of global politics, and even the global south role among the changing dynamic. So, economic rise of the global south over the past few decades, countries like China, Brazil, India, Indonesia, South Africa, they've seen significant economic growth, reshaping the global political and economic landscape. And even BRICS, the formation of BRICS exemplifies the shift towards a multipolar world where countries of the global south they seek to challenge the dominance of the global north, particularly in terms of economic and political influence. So the leadership of the global south, how even the leaders at Bandung who sought to create a fairer global system, it is relevant today. Then we have the last article for today, a tale of two revolutionaries from Bangalore, Bengal. So Lies and Allies, Spies, Lies and Allies, and Extraordinary Lives of Chato and Roy. So it basically provides a compelling exploration of two often forgotten revolutionaries, Virendranath Chattopadhyay and M.N. Roy, who played pivotal roles in India's struggle for independence. And this basically emphasizes their ideological battles and international connections, highlighting their involvement in global revolutionary movements in places like Russia, Germany, and Japan. and it is critics for maintaining narrative of India's freedom movement, which often neglects figures like Chatto and Roy in favor of more prominent leaders like Gandhi and Nehru. So, by presenting their parallel lives, Rao challenges the conventional understanding of success in the independence struggle, especially as both revolutionaries face significant ideological divisions and political failure despite their tireless effort. So, the book's relevance it extends beyond just historical narrative and offers valuable learnings, lessons for understanding the diversity of thought within India's independence movement, and it basically provides a fresh lens through which to view the ideological conflicts which shape the course of India's struggle, making it relevant to topics like complexities of Indian nationalism, ideological divides, and international revolutionary movements. And this book sheds light on the selective nature of historical memory, questioning how certain revolutionary figures are forgotten while others dominate the national narrative. So this was all for today. Thank you, everyone.